The subject matter of this video is the problem of not being able to read log files because of file permissions and directory permissions. The information that I found, which brought to my attention a possible solution, was found at this website. And the question that this person posed was how to enforce specific permissions on newly created logs which are created by log rotate. All right, the key thing is log rotate. You have to be aware that if you use Ubuntu, there is a service called log rotate which handles log files. Basically, I don't know if it creates the log files, but it handles the backing up and naming and setting up the file permissions for log files. To my understanding, the way that logging on Linux works is, first of all, each service that runs on the Linux machine emits messages and errors. Any executing script on a Unix machine takes input on standard input and outputs on standard output. And it also outputs on standard error. Okay? So every functioning program, every service, or you could think of it as every process that runs on a Linux machine has streams coming in and going out of that process. And they are called standard in, standard out, and standard error. I believe you can also create other streams besides those ones, but these are the basic ones. So when a process, and I'm using the word process to refer to all the other descriptions, like whether you want to call it a process, a program that's running, a daemon, a service, I'll just all call them a process. Okay, so a process emits errors on its standard error output stream. Those errors can be handled either by the program or process itself, or they can be handled by the system. In other words, by the Linux operating system. For example, I'll just use PHP as an example. I don't know if this is the way it actually works, but some services work this way. PHP gives you the option to have either the system handle the logging of errors, or the other option is for it itself to handle the logging of errors. Logging of errors basically means that you are storing the errors in a file on the hard drive so that there is a permanent record of that error that occurred or that event that occurred. So in this video, I'm going to mainly talk about log rotate, which is part of the Linux operating system's functionality, which handles the logging of messages coming from a process. So we're back to this question of how to enforce specific permissions on newly created logs which are created by log rotate. And I'll reiterate my problem, which is I want to have PHP scripts which can read these log files. By default, log rotate, or the system, when it is handling the log files, it sets very restrictive permissions which don't allow others to read these files, or sometimes it even does not allow others to enter the directories where these files are located. Now, I can go and just manually change the permissions on these directories and files, but when log rotate creates the new log files, they will be with the same permissions that log rotate is configured to give to these log files. So I will have to continually, every time it rotates or creates these files, I will have to manually go in and change the permissions just so that my PHP scripts can read from those files. And that is not practical. So, as I have discovered, there are two things that I have to do to get things going the right way. One is to actually go and change the permissions on the existing files. And the second is to configure logrotate so that it does not give permissions which are too restrictive. And in this video, that's what we're going to explore, is how to get that done. This person who wrote this question expressed it pretty good, although he did make some grammatical mistakes. He says, I've noticed that the mail logs which are being created in var log are being created and owned by root. In other words, both the user is root and the group is root. I've written a Nagios check. By the way, Nagios is a piece of software which helps monitor servers, okay? So he says, I've written a Nagios check which monitors the log, and in order to allow the Nagios user to access it, I have the other group read permissions that is. Okay, I'll explain what he's saying here. In his example, Nagios corresponds to my PHP scripts which need to read these log files. So in order for him to have his Nagios, and in order for me to have my PHP scripts access the log files, he says, I gave the other group read permissions. For those watching on the internet who don't know what is meant by the other group, every file or directory has permissions for the owner, a group, and then the third set of permissions are for other. In other words, everyone who is not the owner and is not member of the specified group. So he gave the other read permissions. That way, so Nagios, which falls under the category of other, can read those log files. And the command that he used in order to give the read, which is the R, permission to other is chmod O for other plus R, and then the name of the log file. Then he says, now, when I think about it, this is only one log file. When the log file will get filled, the logrotate mechanism will rename this file and open a new one. In other words, there will be a new file called var log mail log. Okay? But the new mail log file will not have the read, and here he says write. Okay, read is the permission. Write is, in other words, the right to do something. So will not have the read write which I allowed. So my question is, how can I make sure that the logrotate mechanism will create all the new mail log files with the right, in other words, right like legal rights, permission for the Nagios user? Okay, so now we've clearly identified the problem. So I believe now is the time to explore the solution. The person who answered starts off by saying, logrotate has the create option. What he means is the configuration for the logrotate service has a directive called create, and that directive fits this mold. It starts with the word create, then here for mode you specify the file permission mode. For owner, you specify the username of the owner. For group, you specify the group that has permissions on this file. Everybody else will be other. And then he gives a visual of how this directive would look like in one of the configuration files for logrotate. And he says that this is either in Etsy logrotate.conf or a separate file in a directory in Etsy called logrotate.d. And then he says check if no other file already overrides this. And then he says how this is configured depends on the operating system. On Ubuntu, this is handled in the rsyslog configuration. Okay, when I did this, I just went into the logrotate.d directory and I made changes for the specific daemons that I was concerned about. For example, MySQL logging, Apache logging, and PHP FPM logging. And basically, you can dig around in those files and there's more instructions and more clues over there on how to set up the logrotate to create its new log files with permissions which allow other to read them. And that's it for this video.